have announced in relation to the issue of not having to make a choice between the idea of privatisation and also not putting investment into much needed public infrastructure and public services and community services and the transition to renewable energy. The package that we announced, and I'd be very happy to share it with you afterwards because it sounds like you'd be interested in more detail around it, is the idea that we should not be afraid of borrowing billions of dollars over a 20-year plan that would allow us to invest in significant infrastructure. It would allow us to transition New South Wales to a renewable energy future, and it would be done in a way that that money would be able to be paid back and returned over 20 years. What we see is actually a commitment to ongoing tax subsidies. Sorry, just hold on to a penny. What we're seeing is, by both Labor and Liberal, ongoing tax subsidies and tax exemptions for the fossil fuel and racing and gambling industries, including the graveyard industry, which was the first announcement by the Labor leader when he took office, that is actually not putting the priorities in the right places when it comes to spending money in the economy and the state. What we need to see is actually a serious conversation about the fact that we shouldn't be afraid to say that some people are getting exemptions when other people, vulnerable people, are suffering. And at the same time, we should say, if we're borrowing to invest in the future of this state, we should feel comfortable with that, provided we do it in a way that means that that debt is then serviceable.
People get tired about this subject on last. One of the things that's happened in Australia during the Howard government period was that they had a windfall from the mining boom, and they also sold off a lot of public assets. So they were able to pay down the debt. But what they then did is turned around and tried to make out that was some sort of virtue, and that it was a value in itself, and that it should be applied generally for everybody for the rest of all time. But it's actually not, as you say, it's really not a virtue. We all borrow money. The interest rate's really low at the moment because we're desperate to get people to borrow money so that they can employ people. So really, there's nothing in principle wrong with borrowing money. But we've got to be careful that we don't use borrowing to reduce taxation levels, for example. It's a big subject, but it's not a reason to just pass the buck to the next generation. Thank you.
And our next question. Hi, good evening. My name is Chris. I'm from the Surrey Hills corner of our electorate. I'd like to ask some questions about housing affordability. If we accept that New South Wales is the engine of the Australian economy, and that the City of Sydney and the inner city is the engine of the New South Wales economy, particularly in relation to high-value service jobs, we have a real crisis within inner city Sydney in terms of housing affordability. Apart from any equity issues, whether it's related to intergenerational equity, whether it's in relation to tenant rights, in relation to social housing, what I'd like all of the candidates to respond to is, what are your parties going to do in relation to things like maintaining that there's a quota of affordable housing for any new housing project, protecting legal rights of tenants. In any other city in the developed economy, there are far better legal rights in terms of minimum leases, and also in terms of the reasons that landlords can and can't give to turf people out, and also CPI indexation of things like rents, and also catering to low-cost housing and affordable housing so that we keep the inner city being diverse and we're not all cookie cutters of affluent high earners. Thank you.
CDP has been active on the issue of affordable housing. Paul Green chaired the parliamentary inquiry into it. I think one area we can look at is negative gearing. I think that does, and I have raised that with Paul Green. I was at Clover Moore's function yesterday and saw the quotas, and I think that that's a good idea. to would have a policy would rely on compassion and equity. Affordable housing is definitely a must. People shouldn't. One of the criteria for people living in Sydney shouldn't be how much money you've got, or any other criteria, race, whatever. Everybody has the right to enjoy Sydney and live throughout Sydney. There shouldn't be pockets of wealthy area, pockets of poor areas that promote social breakdown.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's pretty clear that we need to be really addressing the housing affordability crisis, and I think it was a credit to Clover Moore and the City of Sydney Council, the amazing forum that they held last night, bringing together a whole lot of experts, albeit only one woman on the stage out of a panel of 9, but a whole lot of experts talking about the issue of affordable housing. The Greens have had a long-term commitment to affordable housing, and the answer to the last question, which talks about not being afraid to borrow money, and we announced as part of that plan to want to invest $4.5 billion into affordable housing and addressing that. But you mentioned the issue of percentages of new developments having an amount of affordable housing. The Greens' position is that we should see a minimum of 10% across the state of affordable housing on new build developments that will actually have 10 dwellings or more in them. Clover Moore, I know, is talking about larger figures in the order of 20 to 30%, and that's not to say we shouldn't be encouraging councils in high density areas to be looking at that. I just wanted to say one thing briefly on affordable and, on public and community housing. One of the things that we also need to see is that we need to recognise that if we invest in that part and actually support those most in need of help in the housing crisis, we'll actually alleviate some of the stress on other areas when it comes to housing affordability. And we also released a renters' rights plan which would stop no grounds evictions and stop more than annual increases to rents, but I can share more about that with you later.
Sorry, Rob, used to go this way now.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. I think that's you asked the question really well, and I'm not going to go over every one of the points about diversity, which is really important, renter rights, minimum leases, and a few other things. But I do want to mention that behind this there is the problem of how much all of our houses are now valued at. And the housing has just become so expensive. There are a number of people, probably many people in this room, and I'll say myself as included, who have done very well out of the massive increases in house values. In about 1976, I think it was, I bought a 5-bedroom terrace only 500 metres from here for $27,000. It's just, and I was a university student at the time. It's just not fair to the next generation that things go like they are. But why are they going like they are? There's a population increase, massive population increase, and there's a lack of supply. So really, it's not just a matter of rent control. It's really about supply and the inability of supply to keep up with this ever-increasing demand. But there are some big issues there. Thank you.
Okay, we've probably got time for these 2 more questions, and I know there's another question over here.
Thank you. My name is Richard Thode. I've lived in Newtown since 1984, so I've seen quite a bit of stuff come and go. Since the mid-90s, I've worked in public health, some of that time in drug and alcohol, which, as you would understand, covers other addictions than just drugs and alcohol. And I had a question very specifically for Penny Sharpe, who unfortunately had to go even though this was a 7:30 session, as I understood. My question was simply, could she explain to me why her leader decided that they should halve the tax on horse racing? Sorry, I wonder if people who are left could at least give their thoughts on that.
Come back from this end.
Thank you for that question. And this is a long way from the normal interests of push bike riders, for sure. But as a resident of the in the Sydney over many years, I've been regularly appalled by the way governments have looked after the club industry, the gambling industry, the racing industry, and I think they're causing a lot of social harm, and the revenue we're getting from them is just not really addressing the harm that they're causing. So, our party will certainly be very keen to work with governments to reduce these negative impacts that we're getting from particularly gambling and alcohol. Thank you.
I'm also sorry that the Labor and Liberal candidates aren't here to answer a question that talks about subsidies to the racing industry and tax exemptions for racing and gambling. When we look at the kinds of things that we could deliver in areas such as domestic violence, where the peak body looks at wanting to invest $100 million a year to be able to prevent domestic violence in this state, and yet we see the Labor leader's first announcement to grant hundreds of millions of dollars in tax exemptions for the racing industry. I can't even begin to explain where that logic is. I would say to you that it's a clear example of this state headed in the wrong direction, and I can commit to you that if I was representing this area, I would not stand silently while those announcements were being made.
Well, I agree with all three of the sentiments, and it just begs belief after everyone's seen what happens in the racing industry, particularly greyhounds. First thing we got to do is take this chunk of money and fix your problem. Is that what you want your taxpayers' money to spend on? Propping up with industries that abuse animals? I think it's quite obvious that the government, state and federal are beholden to the animal racing industry because of the tremendous stream of tax revenues they get from that, gambling revenues. Near excuse to say, well, it's an industry. We don't want to do anything to lose jobs. There's a tired old argument. You can't keep throwing good money after bad. These industries have been known for cruelty. These scandals and investigations into the industry began before my time. And all government can do is say, well, we'll fix the little problem, we'll disqualify you, make you resign. 6 months later, everything's back to the way it was. It just begs belief that the government can be so irresponsible with our money. I think Tim Costello once used the phrase that governments are mainlining on gambling revenue. So it's obviously a reference to a lack of reason. Gambling does a huge amount of damage in our community. If one person gambles away a huge amount of money, it affects the individual, it affects their household, it affects their extended family, and then if they end up in need of government services, it affects the entire community. So I think we need to take a hard line with the gambling industry, we need to stop subsidies, and we need to put very strict rules in place to make sure that the gambling industry does little or no harm. And right at the top of my list would be the Star City bus cruising through some of the lowest socioeconomic areas in Sydney. I think that's something that I think is abhorrent and needs to stop straight away.
Next question.
Thank you. Are the candidates aware that when the homelessness funding in New South Wales was tendered for and redistributed, not all of the services that were funded under that were primarily homelessness services, but that some of them were primarily violence against women's services, such as women's domestic violence, refuges and other related services? And are they aware that in many cases these services were removed from their specialist providers, specialist domestic violence providers, and given to generalist welfare and generalist homelessness services, which don't have links with the rest of the domestic violence networks, and which are not as well placed to provide these services? And would candidates, if elected, pledge to work to try and restore coordination and integration amongst violence against women's services by restoring services to organisations that had specialist expertise in the area and that were linked? And I guess as background to this, I would add that New South Wales has one of the least, before this happened, New South Wales had one of the least integrated systems in dealing with domestic violence of all states. They could compare themselves to Victoria or South Australia and some other states, and people would come off very poorly. So would candidates pledge to work towards better integration and restoring these sorts of services to specialist providers?
We'll come back from this way.
Well, I had two main points if I was asked a question on domestic violence. Most of us are aware that if we see a story on the news involving suicide, there are help numbers that come up on the screen, and both Paul Green and I strongly favour. There was just a recent incident in southwest Sydney that's exploded in the news in the last 24 hours. I'm sure it's on the television news if I was home to watch that. When that story gets reported, I'd love to see helplines for both perpetrators and victims, not in any way softening the approach to perpetrators, but if they want to self-report and get help, let's give them that option, and of course give victims helplines on television whenever there's a news story. Also, just as the gambling industry needs to be held into account, CDP has a strong track record of holding the alcohol industry to account, because alcohol is often a significant factor in domestic violence, and we need to put tough rules in place on the alcohol industry.
I agree with those issues as well. Domestic violence is a terrific thing, but there needs to be balanced debate as well. As was mentioned, usually the perpetrators have an issue, be it alcohol or psychiatric, whatever. Both sides of that need to be addressed. For every issue, every incident, there's always two versions of the story. So it needs to be balanced and look at both ways. And further to address the question, the local operators obviously have a better idea of handling the people in their local area. The last thing the victim of something like domestic violence wants to go to walk into a big bureaucracy and be treated like an owner. They want people to understand and they're on the ground for them. They don't want to go with a sampling office situation and have to go through all the red tape to get something out. They want immediate attention. They want someone that knows their local area, someone that can help them, someone that has a network of referrals to help the people concerned as well.
Thanks so much for the question. I'd have to say that I've been pretty inspired by the grassroots campaigning and feminists that have come out in support of the threats to women's refuges in the inner city and across the state as a result of some pretty hideous moves to shut down services that have been providing support to women who are sufferers of domestic violence and survivors of domestic violence for decades, that have had to shut their doors as a result of this policy. The Greens are committed to funding specialist refuges and domestic violence services for women, but we also recognise the need for those services to address the special needs and diversity of women themselves, and that means gender diverse services, youth services, services that respect different cultural and religious backgrounds. The other thing we need to do though is recognise that violence against women is something that we can stop if we invest the money in the education programs to do it. Violence against women is not inevitable, but we need a commitment from governments to put money into prevention if we are going to stop it, and that's what the Greens are committed to being able to campaign with the community to be able to do.
Thank you. It's really very, very sad to see, to read the reports, and but if there's only one good thing, it's that we are now hearing more and more. We're hearing about violence that's happening, intimidation that's happening in all sorts of places. And it's not just against women, it's against children and in workplaces. So I think that this is becoming a much higher community concern, and it's a good sign that we are openly talking about this. We've obviously got a long way to go, but our party is certainly very concerned and regards this as a very high priority issue.
This will be our final question, and then the candidates will have an opportunity to wrap up.
Hi, my name is Andrew Tudor. I'm a family man for living in Erskineville, also involved with the Friends of Erskineville fair bit. You might want to get your pens out and grab a bag with a collection of issues. About a year ago, the Friends of Erskineville did a community survey on things that the community were very concerned about, and a number of things came up there, and also things that have come up over in the last year with Friends of Erskineville. I just want to list these things to you and perhaps get your opinion on some of them. One thing that occupied people a lot, or the major thing, was overdevelopment in the Ashmore estate. Previously the plan was for a maximum of 5 stories there, and then the government at the time supported 19 stories, and the community fought back a bit, and it sort of settled back to about 9 stories. I'm not 100% sure that this is absolutely fixed over the eastern part of Ashmore estate, and so I'm interested in your opinion on whether you believe or you would support the maintaining or the reduction of those heights, the 9-storey heights. City of Sydney, we lost our votes to a certain extent from recent legislation. That was 2 votes for business and 1 for residents, and we're still, people are rather concerned about that. Do you think that business owners should have a vote over and above the vote that people already get that from being a resident or a worker anyway? The station access at Erskineville is a big issue. We have a petition at the moment to install a lift at Erskineville, so if you go to change.org or search for that on the Friends of Erskineville website, please sign the petition. We've already got 110 signatures already, so what's your opinion on station access at Erskineville? There's a strong community campaign for a high school. There's been a recent announcement about that. What's your position on a new inner-city high school? And lastly, the privatisation of the AGP has been something that a lot of us, the possible sale of the Australian Technology Park at Beverley, and the possible loss of public housing there as well, is something that engages us in Friends of Erskineville. So, if you've got any comments on those things, that'd be really appreciated. Thank you.
Well, I've mentioned many times that I want accessible train stations, and Erskineville is definitely on the list. Now, we run Australian Rail Summation. No.
Answer the question first, then we'll go back to the speaking order.
Okay. Well, I think Erskineville should get a lift, and we'll campaign very strongly for any changes to get lifts as well. Yeah, for many years, railway stations have been very inaccessible to a lot of people. It's only probably the last 5 years, government sort of woken up, hey, people up there wheelchairs can't get on the train. It's taken a long time to do that. But people like that have always been marginalised, and they'll still be marginalised because you people are trying to fight for a lift. But Erskineville, there are many, many stations around Sydney that have the same sort of issue. Newtown, and a few others have got lifts. But why stop a couple? They should be rolling them out. Every station doesn't have it. If you want to be equitable to everybody in this city, you've got to give everyone equal opportunities to do everything, yet government have policies that have struggled with that all the time.
Thanks very much. I'll try to do them all. The Australian technology parks, Greens oppose the sell-off of that. It's outrageous that we're selling it off. It's a crucial part of open space, heritage, our industrial heritage and history, and an amazing place that should not be put in private developers' hands. The inner city high school, the Greens support the need for one. I think we need to have a conversation about how we're forward projecting where the demands are. Remember, it was under Labor that actually Erskineville, which was at the time said not to be needed, was threatened to be sold off for Erskineville Public School, and I think that the Greens have had a long-term commitment to forward planning when it comes to investment and making sure we service the needs of public education. In relation to station access, we discussed it earlier, the more money we put into tollways and roads, the less money we have for making our trains accessible. The Greens are committed to rolling out accessible stations across the board. City of Sydney business votes, we completely oppose it. We don't support the idea of any business getting to vote. Democracies are about people, and that's who should get votes, not businesses. And the overdevelopment of Ashmore Estate and how we handle the massive influx of people and improve the infrastructure and services around that. I really hope in April I have the opportunity to be representing those views in the Parliament, to be standing up and speaking out for making sure we get increased frequency of train stations at Erskineville, looking at the education and other infrastructure needs, and working to stop overdevelopment destroying our communities.
Thank you. The overdevelopment issue first, that's 5 questions, so 20 seconds each. The overdevelopment, I think 19 stories is just too high, way too high. And 4 and 5 stories, medium developments in areas that where the land is available is something that will help us have more integrated transport solutions. If people are on half-acre blocks, then not that that's what's going on immediately around here, then it's very hard to provide those transport solutions. 2 votes for business, that is just a totally dodgy, obvious way of trying to get rid of Clover Moore, who was a community champion. So, you know, I think everybody in this room is against that. Station access, there are 9 stations in the Newtown electorate, and only 2 of them have access. Good access. That's unforgivable, it's unacceptable. Sale Technology Park, that is public land, and we want to keep it public land.